Welcome back to our class in Hebrews. Today we're going to be looking at Hebrews chapter 13, verses 8 to 16. So we just talked about remembering our leaders and imitating the right people of faith. Now we're going to get into the promise of Jesus and what that means for our faith. And so let's jump in. It starts off today. Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forever. So this is going to be the jumping off point for his practical application that we're going to talk through today, which leads us to what sacrifices we should be offering. So if Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forever, that is an incredible promise. The yesterday calls back to the cross. Today calls back to what he has done. He's still speaking to us today, and tomorrow or forever speaks to the eternal promise, the hope that we are constantly looking forward to, that forward-thinking faith that we've been talking about since Hebrews chapter 11. So if Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forever, then we get into do not be led astray by diverse and strange teachings, for it is good for the heart to be strengthened by grace, not by foods, which have not benefited those devoted to them. One of the issues in the early church that we see all across the epistles is this sect of people called the Judaizers. And what they would do is, after a new church was planted, the church was still kind of seen, especially in the early days, as a sect of Judaism. And so some of the Judaizers were people who believed in Jesus, but would try to convert these Gentile converts or Jewish converts to continuing to follow the Torah law. And what we have here is, it looks like the house church is going back to the old ways and the old systems, which, if you've been paying attention and all throughout Hebrews, there's a convincing of how the new covenant is better and that we don't have to go to the old covenant, that it is becoming obsolete because of Jesus and what he has done. And so we have like a last-ditch effort here to move them away from the old covenant into the new covenant. And he's saying grace is better than food, right? So all of these food laws and washings and things like this, grace is better. The new covenant of grace is so much better because the old food laws was of no benefit. In another epistle in the Bible, it says that this way of living had no benefit in defeating the flesh, the desires of the flesh. And so because of that, he says, we have an altar from which those who serve the tent have no right to eat. He's reminding them that the altar that we go to, which is the heavenly temple that Jesus entered into, the high priest and the priests of the old covenant aren't even allowed to come and eat in this new tent, this new tabernacle. For the bodies of those animals whose blood is brought into the holy places by the high priest as a sacrifice for sin are burned outside the camp. So Jesus also suffered outside the camp in order to sanctify the people through his own blood. And this is great because this is a reminder, again, nobody was allowed inside the old tabernacle. Only the priests were allowed to burn incense and kind of perform these sacrifices and offerings. And so remember, Jesus didn't conform to the old system. He wasn't a Levite. He was from the tribe of Judah. And so Jesus suffers outside of the gate, just like the old animals who were sacrificed and burned outside of the camp. And so Jesus was our sacrifice outside of the camp. And he does this in order to sanctify the people through his own blood. Remember, the sacrifice and the blood that we get is not from animals, is from Jesus. And then this big therefore. And we get a few let us now. If you remember previous, there's a lot of let us do this, let us do this. So because of this, because that Jesus was outside the camp, right? This is a call to leave the old tabernacle, leave the law, leave the old covenant, and come now and be with Jesus. Let us go to him outside the camp and bear the reproach he endured. Philippians chapter 3, verse 10, one of the other epistles, Paul writes, to know him, the fellowship of his suffering, and the power of his resurrection. And there's this understanding in the New Testament that in order to actually know Jesus well, we have to suffer, because suffering is what Jesus experienced. And when we experience suffering, we are actually with Jesus in his suffering. And so this is a call to that same understanding. Go to him outside the camp and bear the reproach he endured. This church didn't want to endure suffering. They didn't want to get their property taken away again, lose their lives this time. But the call from the writer is go outside the camp and suffer with Jesus. Bear the reproach he endured. He was mocked, he was killed, his clothes were taken from him, everything he had. He was shamed in front of everybody. And so the call is for us, church, now to also not live comfortable lives inside what we know, which would be the tabernacle for the Jews, but to come outside the camp and to suffer with Jesus. And that is the place of getting to know Jesus. And so when you suffer, when you go through hardship, when you go through pain and loss, know that you are close with Jesus, that he's close to the brokenhearted, that you are understanding Jesus more, that you are getting to know Jesus more and through your sufferings and his suffering, because that is where Jesus is, outside of the camp. For here we have no lasting city, but we seek the city that is to come. This is that theme of pilgrimage, again, that we've been looking at all throughout chapter 12 and chapter 13, that we are not of this world. We are not citizens of any kingdom of this world. We are not citizens of any people group of this world. Our citizenship is now a heavenly citizenship. And so like Abraham, we are now sojourners in the land, and we are looking for the city of God. And so the call to leave the tabernacle, leave what you know, like Abraham left the city of Ur, and now go outside the camp with Jesus, become a pilgrim and suffer, and realize that we are looking for what is better, that suffering is not going to stay forever. We will have to endure through it now in this life, but we will find that eternal rest. We will go to the heavenly place where our citizenship is, and we will get the fulfilled promise of the promised land. Through him, I love this line, then let us continually offer up a sacrifice of praise to God, that is the fruit of lips that acknowledge his name. Do not neglect to do good and share what you have, for such sacrifices are pleasing to God. Throughout the entire book of Hebrews, we are told that the sacrifice is done, that there's only one sacrifice, and that's only one sacrifice is needed. We don't need to do any of the old sacrifices in the old law. This is the first time we are told to now sacrifice or make a sacrifice. And the sacrifice that we are called to make is the sacrifice of praise and of love. The sacrifice of praise is to acknowledge God for who he is and praise his name. So if we recall the Lord's Prayer in Matthew in the Sermon on the Mount, he says, "Our Father, hallowed be thy name," or how I like to translate that when I teach my kids the Our Father is, "Our Father, praise to your name." Right? We start off with the majesty, the beauty, the greatness of God, because it really centers everything in our life and makes us remember his sovereignty, remember his goodness, remember how great he is. He's bigger than my problems, bigger than whatever it is that is aggressively coming at me. He is greater. And so the sacrifice that we give is the sacrifice of our lips, right? The praise that we give to him. And then the sacrifice of doing good and sharing. So of generosity and good works. This is all wrapped up in love. As we've talked about before, love is the great fruit of the Spirit. Why? Because God is love, so the more loving we become, the more loving we are, the more loving we act towards others, we are becoming like God in that. And that is the ultimate thing that God is shaping us into and forming us into an image of himself, as we are his image bearers. And so this is a great understanding, because we can't have one without the other. If we have the sacrifice of praise, which is we're really good at singing songs, we're really good at blessing God and talking about how amazing he is, but we don't have love, then we have nothing. This is repeated in James and 1 Corinthians, all over the New Testament, that without the works, remember, love is not a feeling in the New Testament. Love is an action. It is a verb. It is something that you do. It is something that is outward in how you work with your hands and care, right? The two things that we have here is love is described as good works and sharing, generosity towards others, not hoarding, all of this stuff. We a few classes ago talked about being content with what we have, not being greedy. And so if we have all of the right words but none of the action, then as James said, our faith is dead. We don't have real faith. But if we have all of the action but we don't have the confession of who Jesus is and who God is, then we are not really having true spiritual food. I think of how Jesus feeds the 5,000. We see these two things at play here. He gives them physical food, good works, but he also gives them spiritual nourishment. He talks to them about himself, who is the true bread, the true vine. And that is what we are called to live as. We can't just have words, but we don't just have dead actions. What we have is a combined confession of faith that transforms all of who we are, that causes us to live and act differently towards others. And so I want us to remember that the only sacrifice in Hebrews that we are asked to give is a sacrifice of praise and good works, and how they go hand in hand. And so tomorrow or the next class will be our last kind of what is acceptable worship, as we've been doing that, going through all these practical things of what it means to have acceptable worship to God. Tomorrow's our last one before we get to the final class, where we'll read our benediction and our closing remarks from the author of Hebrews. Thanks for coming today, and look forward to seeing you in the next class.